Good evening. My name is Jackie Reese. I'm the current president of the League of Women Voters of the White Bear Lake area. We'd like to welcome you all here tonight. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan volunteer organization which encourages citizens to participate in government. Our mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. We are nonpartisan. We do not support or oppose any candidate or political party. Our White Bear Lake Area League is one of 34 leagues across the state of Minnesota. Before we start our program, I'd like to take a minute to share our land acknowledgement. The League of Women Voters of White Bear Lake area acknowledges that the land we are on is the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homeland of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We recognize that indigenous peoples have experienced loss of their homestead and threats to their culture. Despite these circumstances, the resilience of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples is apparent as they reclaim their land and their culture. They are our neighbors, and they're sharing their stories. We pledge to listen, to learn, and to advocate for their rights. This evening, we've gathered together to think about and learn more about our Constitution, and in particular, the role of the Supreme Court. Before we introduce our speaker, and on behalf of our league, I want to say that, as I stated earlier, we are a nonpartisan organization, and we take that seriously as we look at some of the issues challenging us today. We are nonpartisan, but we are not neutral. We have a long history of studying issues and developing policies and positions based on those studies, which are approved through a consensus process by all leagues throughout the country. This past winter, we were involved in just such a study on the federal judiciary. We want to share the results of that with you, and I'd like to ask Dana Carlson from our league to talk a little bit about that study and the positions that were adopted as a result. Dana?
Hello, thank you for coming. We're very excited to introduce what the league came up with for this position. And what I'm going to do actually is read out this position and then the definitions they have for the principles in there, because we want to get to our speaker because we're really excited about him. So the league's position, statement of position on the federal judiciary as announced by the National Board June 2025. The League of Women Voters of the United States believes that all powers of the United States government should be exercised within the constitutional framework of the balance of powers among the three branches of government. The League believes that within the bounds of the U.S. Constitution, the overarching principles of transparency, accountability, independence, and ethics are essential to an effective federal judiciary. These principles are not only essential for a strong democracy, but foster public trust in the federal judiciary and adherence to the rule of law, the essence of our constitutional democracy. So we've got the four principles. Transparency, as defined by the League. Federal court documents, proceedings, and rulings, including those in the shadow docket cases, which I'm sure everybody knows what they are now, because they've used it so much, should be open and available to the public within the bounds of the law, recognizing the need for limited exceptions, such as legally protected sensitive information. And this actually comes in, stare decisis actually comes into this too, because it's like, are they actually following the rules? Are they making rules that we know what they are? Because if they're in the shadow docket, they're not publishing anything. We don't know. Why did they take it? Why didn't they not take it? Accountability. Federal judges and justices should be held legally and ethically responsible for the integrity of their actions with enforceable consequences for violations. And that would include things like financial disclosures. Also recusal, I think, goes into accountability. Independence. Federal judges and justices should act in accordance with the Constitution and statutory and case law, free from the influence of other branches of the government, and free from shifting popular and political opinion. And that's where it would be nice if we had some, like rather than lifetime appointments, adopting some kind of rotation where they would retire and you'd have new ones coming in and things like that, but that's not likely to happen anytime soon. Ethics. Federal judges and justices should adhere to ethical standards of conduct that apply universally at all levels of the federal courts, because right now they don't. The Supreme Court has its own pretty lame little code of ethics that they sort of adopted but don't really follow because people said they needed one. there should be a meaningful enforcement process with judges and justices subject to penalties for failure to comply with the standards. And so obviously the League of Women Voters would like to see them actually adopt an ethics code with teeth that was enforceable. And all of these things, the idea is that the League believes that the elements of this position contribute to judicial integrity, which is really important right now, because if we don't trust the Supreme Court, then, or that there's even a rule of law that anybody cares about, then it's really a big problem for democracy. So the adherence to the principles of accountability, transparency, independence, and ethics ensures both a strong federal judiciary and a stronger democracy. Now Diane's going to introduce our speaker for the next lab.
Welcome. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. Professor Timothy R. Johnson is Horace T. Morse Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Law at the University of Minnesota, an internationally recognized expert on the U.S. Supreme Court and its oral arguments and decision-making process. He has published more than 70 articles, book chapters, and publicly facing papers, 2 monographs, and 6 books, including most recently SCOTUS and COVID in 2023. Findings from many of these projects, along with his legal and political commentary, have appeared in The Economist, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. He is a highly sought speaker. Professor Johnson has his bachelor's degree in political science and Russian studies from Gustavus Adolphus College, and his master's degree and doctoral degrees from Washington University in St. Louis. Practitioners, including members of the Illinois Supreme Court and its clerks, the United States Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Advocates Society of Canada, and Canadian Supreme Court, have sought Johnson's expertise. In 2024, he was appointed to the advisory board of Brown versus Board of Education Revisited project, which was a winner of a 2025 American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award for Media and the Arts. Professor Johnson is also a distinguished educator. He has mentored 15 graduate students and overseen more than 250 undergraduate research projects. In 2018, he won the American Political Science Association's Distinguished Teaching Award. Here's a fun fact from Tim. I have a pub trivia team with a group of friends called The Cure, and we win much more often than we lose. So let's welcome Professor Johnson.
As I told Diane before, I'm the weak link on the team. I'm bad at music. I'm pretty darn good at sports. And they're lucky if if we get a Supreme Court question. And we have won once because we had a Supreme Court question as a final question. I appreciate you all asking me here tonight. I take it as part of my teaching duties as a professor at a land-grant university to teach well beyond the classroom. And so I will, unless my schedule does not allow it, always say yes to whatever civic organization, and I have a special place in my heart for the League of Women Voters. I think I gave my first talk to the League my first year here back in Minnesota in 2000, may have been 2001, and I've given a variety of talks to several League groups over the past 25 years, so I appreciate you asking me here tonight. A couple of things before I give my talk, and if my wife were here and she is listening to a better speaker tonight, she's on her way to see David Sedaris. And I've seen David Sedaris enough that I wasn't going to give this up to go with her, so she went with some other friends. But a couple of things. She would tell you that I am verbose, and she wouldn't be lying. I like to hear myself talk. My students might tell you the same thing. So I will try to keep it brief, just to the extent that I think that the better part of the night is interacting with you all. And I will answer as many questions as you have in the time allotted. I actually don't even remember the amount of time allotted. But that means I will try to speak a little bit more quickly, or at least get through my slides a little more quickly so we can have give and take. That's better for me. I hope it will be better for you all as well. The second thing is I ask you not to be angry at the messenger. And that is that this is a difficult message that I'm going to deliver tonight. And it's been a difficult message that I've been delivering for the past probably 3 to 4 years. And for the first time ever this fall, I felt as if I had to warn my students that what I was going to be teaching them in both constitutional law as well as in my class on Supreme Court process, that I was not giving them opinions, that we were still speaking in fact, that we were still speaking about what is happening in this day and age, and that it was not a partisan, it's never a partisan thing for me in front of class, never an ideological thing. But for the first time, it felt like I was going to step in front of class. For the first time in 30 years, I taught my first class in 1995 as a graduate student. For the first time, I felt like my students might actually think I was just feeding them a line of opinions. And so I will say the same thing to you that I say to them, and that is, I am not. That what I am talking about is from a political science, legal, objective perspective, as my view of what is happening with the United States government today and whether or not we are in a constitutional crisis. And I'll just give you the punchline, and the answer is yes. And you'll see that on the final slide tonight. So with those sort of caveats, I will begin. And let me just give a couple opening thoughts about why we may be in a constitutional crisis and sort of set the stage. And it actually begins with this idea of the statement, which I appreciate quite a bit, and that is the separation of powers. And you're all holding a copy of the Constitution. And going back to the founding, the separation of powers was written into law in our premier document, right? The supreme law of the land is the United States Constitution. And it breaks up our federal government into 3 branches for the very specific reason that the founders did not want to go back to where we were. And while there were other Western European nations involved, it was mostly our fight to get out of the grips of England, that we no longer wanted to live under a king or a monarchy of any kind. And in fact, you know that George Washington explicitly said that he would not take the moniker of king. And then he very quickly, especially if you've seen the musical, said that he was only going to sit for 2 terms, not the Washington musical, the Hamilton one. But the separation of powers are pretty clear. And I don't need to tell you all more. You're a very smart audience. Congress writes the laws, the president or the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. That's it, plain and simple. And you don't really need to say any more than that. And if you'd like to say more, we can talk about it in Q&A, or you can just go and read the document that you're all holding or sitting on. But it's less clear today. And in fact, I changed this bullet point 3 times even today, as I was just messing around with what I wanted to say and what order I wanted to say this in. And you could use much harsher language. And that is, it's become relatively clear in the past almost 10 months that there is no longer a separation of powers. And it's unclear where the power lies and what powers are shared, if any of them are shared. And that's sort of where the talk is going to go, because power at this point is being consolidated into one branch of government, and very specifically into one room in that branch of government, and that is in the Oval Office. And that gets to the theory of the unitary executive, which is a theory that is touted by a wide variety of legal and political scholars, and that is that despite what the founders may have thought about whether we want to live under a monarch or an autocrat, whatever word you may want to use, that in fact it turns out that there is evidence. I will make the case that there's not really evidence, but there are some who argue there's evidence that we really do, or the framers really did think that we should live under a unitary executive. And that leads us to what has happened in 2025, and that is the massive expansion of executive power, really to the detriment of power in the other two branches of government. And I'll explain the relationship between the executive and the other two branches through the rest of the talk, but it's worth also setting up what is happening with the executive branch. And it began very early in the second Trump administration. This is a quote from President Trump, and that is that from him, that the president and the attorney general shall provide the authoritative interpretations of the law for the executive branch. In other words, and I haven't even uttered the words yet, judicial review, if there is to be judicial review, that judicial review of things that happen within the executive branch will be garnered by the executive branch itself. And if you were looking at the slides that were circling or scrolling before the talk, you saw the quote from John Marshall from Marbury versus Madison. I'm not a memorization teacher. I'm terrible at memorization. My memory's always been bad. It's one of the reasons that I didn't run for office, because I can't remember anybody's name to save my life. My wife makes fun of me for it all the time, because I'm very sure that I will walk up to Diane and think that Diane's name is Sally, and I will just very proudly say, "Hi, Sally. Do you remember me from that talk I gave in White Bear that time?" And so I stopped doing that at the behest of my wife. But one of the things that I encourage my students to memorize when I teach common law is that phrase from Marbury versus Madison. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. End of story. And we could debate until the cows come home whether or not John Marshall made judicial review up out of whole cloth, or whether the framers intended for the judiciary to have judicial review from the start, which is actually the true story, if you want to buy my argument. But nobody, including the executive at the time, George Washington, or any of the other framers, thought that judicial review would lay in the hands of the president and the attorney general, even if only on, I'll put this in air quotes, small issues of things happening in one full branch of the government. But that stage was set at the beginning of this new administration by making that claim. And there really wasn't a whole lot of pushback. There was pushback from the Chief Justice of the United States exactly once, and it was not on this particular issue. And I'll come back to that in just a couple of minutes. So first off, we've got judicial review laying in the hands of the president. Then we have a concept that we have now all probably forgotten about, to some extent, because DOJ is gone, but we know that the executive branch also created a new agency, although that agency, if it was to be a real agency, should have been created by the legislative branch of the United States. Again, something I'll come to in a couple of minutes. But note that DOJ did a whole number of things. Under the Executive Order 14215, called the Ensure Accountability of Agencies Executive Order, the president gutted Medicare, Medicaid, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Department of Defense, the Department of Education, the FAA, FEMA, IRS, NIH, NOAA, the Treasury, and USAID. And I say that not just to read you a list of letters, but for you to come back and remember what was happening in late January, early February, into March, into the early spring, into the early summer even, that a second part of the plan of the executive branch was that there would be this sort of shadow agency that would go in and was supposed to save money, but ended up gutting large portions of the executive branch. The third thing that happens with expansion of executive power in 2025 is tariffs. And we know that in the early 19th century, so right around 100 years ago, Congress did cede some power to the President of the United States to set tariffs, but only under very specific reasoning and under specific circumstances. And in fact, in this case, the Congress of the United States spoke nothing about tariffs, about whether it wanted to retain the power to levy tariffs, whether it wanted to delegate the power to levy tariffs. It simply sat silent, and that's going to be a theme about Congress for the rest of my talk. And so the president simply decided that he would levy tariffs, and you may remember the announcement in the Rose Garden, before the Rose Garden was changed, that the president was levying tariffs on 90 different countries, including one country where no human being lived and only penguins lived. So we've got the power of judicial review now in the executive branch very early on in 2025. We have a wholesale changing of the executive branch by going in with not fine-tooth combs, and I'm not making this up. You probably saw the video with a chainsaw and cutting apart many executive agencies. And then the President of the United States single-handedly and solely deciding when, whether, and how much tariffs will be on other countries in the United States. And so the question all of this begs is this: can the other branches do anything about it? Will they do anything about it? And if they try to do anything about it, will what they do have any effect? So let's talk first about Congress and the president. And the powers, again, just as I began, are relatively clear. Article 1 lays out the authority of Congress. And let me just say this, whether it's my Intro to American Politics class all the way up to constitutional law, I tell my students, and it is absolutely positively the case, that the framers believed the entire political game would be played in Congress. And the reason for that is that Congress, not the Senate, but at least the House, is the closest to the people in the federal government. Right? We don't actually vote for the president. We vote for electors who then decide whether or not we've made a mistake, and then the electors in the Electoral College cast their votes for the president. At the time, state legislatures voted for senators, and while we did ultimately, under the 12th Amendment, get direct election of senators, especially in large states like California, Texas, Florida, New York, maybe name a few others, senators are representing the entire state. And even in our great state of Minnesota, just having Senator Klobuchar and Senator Smith for an entire state that is so geographically large with 5 million or more people, that's a lot to do in terms of representing the people. So it's the House members that keep us, that keep close to us and are meant to make sure that Congress is held accountable. But within those powers in Article 1, specifically in Article 1, Section 8, the end of Article 1, Section 8 is known by several different terms. Some call it the elastic clause. Others call it the necessary and proper clause, which is probably its more technical and proper name, and that is, and this is one that I don't have my students memorized, so I don't have the exact words memorized, but essentially it goes like this. Congress shall have the power to do all that is necessary and proper to carry out the laws that it passes. And that then leads to the power of Congress to create executive agencies, because who enforces the laws Congress passes? The executive branch. So Congress then goes ahead and is able to create agencies that will enforce the laws that it passes. Think just EPA. Congress passes some environmental law. It takes until the Nixon administration for the EPA to be created, but the EPA is created and is then imbued with the authority to enforce those laws. So part of the relationship between the executive branch and the legislature is that Congress has this ability to create executive agencies. Okay? On the other hand, or in addition, I should say, before I say on the other hand, Congress has oversight over those agencies. And it always has had oversight. That is, it can have committees that have inquiries if they think that an agency has not done well or has maybe done something particularly well, for being nice. They hold hearings. They hold funding controls, because the biggest power Congress has is the power of the purse. And in fact, if Congress doesn't want to fund a particular agency, and we can go back to the previous slide, not an entity that's not even an agency shouldn't be making that decision. It's Congress's decision to decide whether or not an agency is funded and then can enforce the laws that Congress has passed. But Congress certainly has oversight over those agencies. And we've all seen it. I would bet more people in this room than in my classrooms when I say this might nod their heads yes. If you watch C-SPAN from time to time, you can watch hearings where, in fact, members of again, name your alphabet soup agency, are brought before Congress to answer questions from whatever committee is in charge of that particular issue. On the other hand, the president also has oversight over committees as well. Why? Because Article 2 suggests, it doesn't suggest, it says explicitly that it is up to the president to see that laws are faithfully executed. And it's not the president who is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States who's going to enforce laws, because the president doesn't have that much time in a day. And so these agencies are acting as the president's agent to enforce laws that are passed by Congress. The president does have some power over those agencies beyond just that oversight, and that is the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, does get to choose who runs the vast majority of those agencies, and in fact chooses some of the higher up officials in those agencies who are oftentimes also held to advice and consent of the Senate. But so there's actually, and this is where the separation of powers is not a full separation of powers, and the checks and balances are not full checks and balances, it's usually a team game. In this case, both Congress and the executive branch have some power over agencies. In other words, in theory, this is a shared power, and I encourage anyone who talks about the separation of powers and checks and balances to think about this as a system of shared powers rather than as a system of separated powers. At least that is how the system has acted since the Constitution was ratified in the late 18th century. There is also very clear precedent about limits on executive power when it comes to laws that are passed by Congress, and it's worth mentioning two. The first is the U.S. Supreme Court has been clear, at least since the early 1950s, that the president cannot carry out or exert power when Congress says the president shouldn't exert that power. The case is a famous one, Youngstown Sheet and Tube. Some of you, if you are in the legal field, may have heard of Youngstown. The long and the short of Youngstown is this. We're in the middle of the Korean War. President Truman wants to make sure that there is enough steel, that we can build tanks and munitions and whatever we need for that war effort. And he simply decides to nationalize the steel industry. And Youngstown Sheet and Tube sues, and the case goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court says, Congress did not give the president the power to nationalize an industry, even in a time of crisis. And if the president is going to nationalize an industry, it needs congressional approval. And there's some other ins and outs of Youngstown, but the bottom line is the president cannot go out of line, or at least historically is not meant to go out of line with what Congress has said or what Congress wants. And the other, which is also incredibly important for this day and age, and that is a case from 1975 called Train versus the City of New York. And this is a case in which President Nixon, happened during the Nixon administration, even though it wasn't decided until 1975. I do know my dates, even though I was only 4 in 1975. Where the president decided that Congress had allocated funds, and he simply did not want to spend those funds. Sounds like a story of recent years, but this is 50 years ago. And the Supreme Court said in no uncertain terms, when Congress spends the money, the only choice the executive branch, aka the president, has is to spend the money the way Congress told him to spend it. And in fact, the choice is also not to spend the money. When the monies have been allocated, the monies need to be spent. End of story. Now, why do I bring up two Supreme Court cases now, and why do I talk specifically about either shared or separated powers between Congress and the president? Because this is the game we are at. And that is, who's going to win the battle of power between Congress and the executive branch? Well, the answer is simple in the short term. It's the president. The government shut down. That's an easy answer. But even before the government shut down a couple of weeks ago, In the short term, the president was going to win because Congress has made itself impotent. Right? It's not just that Congress has gridlock almost always. And in fact, Congress shouldn't have any gridlock right now. The same party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House. There should be absolutely positively no gridlock. And you may or may not have liked what President Obama did or President Clinton did or President Bush did, either the elder or the younger, when they had unified government, but they all got things done. And today, nothing is getting done, and that is almost by design that Congress has decided that it is, by being quiet, ceding power to the President of the United States. So in the short term, the president is going to win if for no other reason than Congress has decided not to fight. Now that could change. It's 13 months now. I forgot to change this slide, I apologize. But in 13 months, we have the midterms. There could be a blue wave. The Democrats could win the House or the Senate or both. And that would be the pressure that many folks have asked to be put on the president to stop the consolidation of power in the Oval Office. The question is whether or not that pressure would even work. The president doesn't want to listen to his own party in Congress if it has differing views of what he wants. What would make anybody believe that if it is the Democrats who are making such an argument, passing such laws that the president might not like, that he would sign them or do anything that Congress would want him to do? But that is sort of the place where the pushback would begin, 13 months from now, because the power that Congress would have there, go back to a slide ago, that is Congress can simply begin to hold hearing after hearing after hearing after hearing and name the official all the way up to the Attorney General of the United States, I suspect, in front of Congress on a regular basis and just grill them daily, hourly, minute by minute. And I can imagine if the Democrats win one or both houses, they will absolutely positively do that. The question is, what's the retribution from the White House? Short term again, despite the one slide ago, where I made it clear that at least historically, there is shared power over executive agencies between Congress and the president now suggests that he has sole authority over agencies. He has sole authority for hiring and firing. He has sole authority over finance and how much, in general finance, how much they will spend, if anything. There is absolute assurity, if that's a word, assurance, that the Supreme Court will side with the president on the issue of firing officials within the executive agency. And the court will, most likely by a vote of 6-3, overturn a 90-year-old precedent and suggest that the president, without any input from Congress, despite what congressional law says for the Federal Trade Commission and then maybe the Fed itself, although the Supreme Court seems less sure that the president has power over the Federal Reserve, the court is most likely by the end of June to allow the president to fire whomever he would like to fire without any repercussion. So the president's claimed this authority. I'm getting to the Supreme Court in a minute, but it's already sliding into the discussion where the court is saying, you can really do whatever you want, and that includes getting rid of people that you don't like. All of this, despite what is known as the major questions doctrine. And the court really got rid of the major questions doctrine in Loper in the 2022 term. And I won't go into, unless you ask during Q&A, the ins and outs of Loper. But the long and the short of the major questions doctrine actually emanates from a case from 40 years ago Chevron and the Chevron doctrine, and they go hand in hand. So let me begin with the Chevron doctrine. The Chevron doctrine says that when Congress passes a law, if that law is unclear, and by the way, 100% of laws that Congress passes are unclear, then when it comes to interpreting what that law means, it's up to an executive agency. So again, stick with the EPA. So Congress passes a law about clean water. It's not clear what particular definitions are. You turn to the experts. And when those cases come in lawsuits all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, it's not the judges or the Supreme Court justices who make the ultimate ruling. Under Chevron, they are meant to defer to the experts. And to me and to the court for 40 years, that's intuitive. Because despite the theory that the 9 are the 9 smartest legal minds in the country, they are not the smartest legal minds on any particular issue. They are not experts. There are very few federal judges who are experts. And those are judges who sit on very specific courts: federal tax court, federal bankruptcy court, federal maritime court. And they get to be experts in those areas of the law. Every other judge on the federal bench is a generalist. So Chevron says you defer. Then you have the major questions doctrine. And the major questions doctrine says that, in fact, the president is, when the president makes decisions over executive agencies, ask those agencies to rule in a particular way on a particular issue, and those cases end up again in court and end up at the United States Supreme Court, that again, those major questions, should they come to the court, you must defer to either what Congress said or what the executive agency said. So again, a combination of major questions and Chevron get you to this idea that, in fact, there should be some power that is left outside of the Oval Office. Now, that seems convoluted, but here's the issue. The Supreme Court is doing two things simultaneously and has been doing so since 2022. One is they are stripping power away from executive agencies, and then when President Trump came into power in January, consolidating power into the Oval Office. And that seems counterintuitive, right? But the theory of a unitary executive is you don't even want those executive agencies. You want the power to be held by one person in particular. So despite the idea that the major questions doctrine suggests that you wouldn't consolidate power, power is being consolidated in the hands of the president. So who's winning when it comes to the fight or the separated powers between Congress and the president? It's the president, right? I don't have to tell you this. You know this. The other question is the judiciary and the president. We know that the court is not supposed to be very strong and was not viewed as very strong. Hamilton thought it was the least dangerous branch. And in fact, in his confirmation hearings 20 years ago, John Roberts said that he really did hope that at some point the court would become irrelevant. And he didn't mean that in the fact, at least he didn't mean it at the time, the fact that he didn't want the court to exist, but that the court would do what he believes judges are meant to do, and that is simply call balls and strikes. And all of the major decisions are left to the elected branches of the government, Congress and the president, okay? So the court is meant to be the least dangerous branch because it doesn't hold the purse. Congress doesn't. It doesn't hold the sword. The executive branch does. And also, because it doesn't hold the sword, has no way to enforce its decisions. And two examples will make the case, one that is just a myth, part of American mythological lore, and the other that really did happen. And the first is the fight between John Marshall and President Andrew Jackson. And the U.S. government, as it wanted land. And they wanted the really good land in southern Georgia and northern Florida where the Cherokee were. And so the military was sent in. They took the Cherokee and they marched them on what we know in our history books as the Trail of Tears. They brought them to the worst land in the country at the time, and that was Oklahoma. Gave them that land. And the U.S. Supreme Court under John Marshall ruled that that decision by the president was unconstitutional. And we know that this didn't happen because it was a decision about something a state government did and not the federal government, but the mythology of American government is that President Jackson said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So get the picture in your mind. The U.S. military, with all of its might, even at the time, is marching a group of people across the southern United States, and the 9 old crotchety guys in their black robes with no guns and no swords are going to go out and stop that. It's not going to happen. The judiciary needs the executive as much as the legislature needs the executive. And I will tell you a story then that you also know, and that is about one of the most famous cases the court ever decided, Brown versus the Board of Education. Without the executive branch, without President Eisenhower, who wasn't himself sure about integrating schools, without Eisenhower saying, actually, this is something we probably should do, and we're going to send troops down to Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia and all of the other southern states and integrate schools because it's the right thing to do, because as Earl Warren wrote, separate is inherently unequal. Schools wouldn't have been integrated, at least in the 1950s, and who knows how long it would have taken. And as it was, schools did not become integrated to an extent that you could say was anywhere close to fully integrated in all 50 states until the early 1970s, some decade and a half after Brown versus the Board of Education. But the point is, of both of those stories, is that the court and all federal courts are pretty well reliant on the executive branch. And if the executive branch says, we ain't going to help you, then the judiciary is really hard-pressed to make anything happen that it would like to happen, especially when you get a president that has specifically threatened to ignore courts' decisions in the United States. And President Trump has been very clear about that, not only saying that judicial review sits in the hands of the president and the attorney general, but saying if the courts don't do don't say what we would like them to say, we will ignore the courts. And the president did say that might not apply to the Supreme Court, but we haven't seen any pushback from the Supreme Court as of yet. And it's unclear what he would do if the court gave him pushback, and the court has given a little bit, just a little bit, in particular with the Federal Reserve. The president has also threatened to have judges impeached who make decisions with which he disagrees. You will note that only one Supreme Court justice has ever been impeached, Samuel Chase in 1804, just after Marbury versus Madison was decided. And you will note that he was not convicted by the Senate and he went back to work. This is the one place where the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, pushed back against the president. And here's what John Roberts said, quote, "For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose." You can't have presidents or members of Congress going around and saying, we want to impeach you because we don't like your decisions. If you don't like the court's decisions, elect different presidents, elect different senators, change the number of justices on the court, perhaps get an amendment or not to have term limits for justices. But you're not impeaching these people because you don't like that they are pro-choice, pro-life, anti-death penalty, pro-death penalty, pro-business, anti-business, whatever it might be. That quote from John Roberts, however, is the only public pushback that the court has made to the President of the United States. The question is, how has the court responded? I've already established, and I think you established from watching the news, as I'm sure most of you do, that Congress is impotent It's doing nothing. How has the court acted? Well, it turns out the court actually hasn't acted like Congress. The court has actually done something. But it's done almost the exact opposite of what the quote from John Roberts suggests the court is upset about, and that is the president really pushing the boundaries of how far he can push the judiciary into a corner. So what has the president done, or what has the court done? You can't read this, but you can see the colors. 21 of 23 cases on the court's shadow docket, and I'm more than willing to take questions about the shadow docket, but it's cases that come to the court on emergency appeal that are decided relatively quickly with no full briefing, with no oral argument, and with no opinion written. The vast majority of the Trump administration cases have come to the court, at least initially, in that shadow docket. And let me say that number again, 21 out of 23 cases. There was an NFL quarterback yesterday that was 21 for 23, and I believe the percentage was 96%. Really good for a quarterback. Probably not so good for the for the United States if the administration is winning all of these cases when, in fact, there are no opinions to go along with it. And this includes shadow docket cases banning transgender athletes or transgender people from the military, mass deportations, as well as the ability to fire agency heads anytime the president would like to sees fit. And you can see the numbers. And the two that are denied, where the president was denied, note that there were no dissents in the first one, and the dissenters in the second one are actually four of the most conservative justices: Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. Okay? And the only way in shadow docket cases that we know how people vote is if they file dissents. If nobody files a dissent, you still might think that a decision is 6-3, but if, in this case, the three liberal justices, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, don't file a written dissent, you wouldn't know how they voted. And that is an issue that we can talk about with the shadow docket. But the bottom line is the green certainly well outweigh the red and the yellow. And the yellows are Trump won part of the case, or the bottom one, the case was dismissed as moot. All that means as a legal term is there was no more legal controversy and nothing for the court to decide, and so they kicked the case out on technical grounds. So the Trump administration is winning a lot, and this deference to the executive branch is different. And here are the data on not just shadow docket cases, but all cases where the administration has asked between the Biden administration and the Trump administration to rule in favor of the government. And it's broken down by the 9 justices. And you can see the partisan and ideological absolute difference. Alito, Gorsuch, 95% of the time vote in favor of Trump, but 18 and 29% respectively in favor of the Biden administration. Kavanaugh and Thomas, 89% for the Trump administration, 41 and 18 for the Biden administration. Barrett and Roberts, 79, 74, 53 each. And then you get the flip to the 3 liberal justices. Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson, and Jackson, 0% of the time voting in favor of the Trump administration, but 77%, 88, and 82 respectively for the Biden administration. Those are high numbers, but they can't win. Generally, that is the 3 liberal justices. The Biden administration was simply losing most of its cases, and the Trump administration is winning in its second term the vast majority of its cases. And the case I will make here before I go on to the final slides and then take questions is this. The bottom row, that the Trump administration has won 84% of the time in 9 months, and the Biden administration only won 53% of the time in its 4 years in office, is a radical departure from how the federal government does before the United States Supreme Court. There's a whole literature in political science and in the legal academy, mostly political scientists, on how successful administrations are. And every administration across partisan lines wins between 70 and 80% of the time. And the argument for that is the story I told about Brown and the story I told about Marshall versus Jackson. And that is the administration is the one that enforces court decisions. And so the court sort of needs to think about the administration and its preferences when making decisions. And it really does the court good in the system of shared powers to have the executive branch happy with it. So historically, 70 to 80% of the time, that's different in the last 4 years and 9 months. And the story here is one where the court has gone from one that I have thought since the time I became a graduate student in 1993, even though I wasn't happy initially when I started thinking about it this way. And these are not my thoughts. These go back to the 1940s from scholars much better than me. And that is that justices are ideological. Right? I think we can all agree on that. Some are conservative, some are liberal. And I think we can stomach that. It might not be the greatest thought to think, but if a justice is ideologically conservative or ideologically liberal and they are consistent because they believe that is the way the law should go, we can stomach that. We might not like the policies that come out of the Supreme Court from time to time, but if someone is being consistent, for the most part, I would put Justice Scalia in that realm. I would put Justice William Brennan in that realm. The difference today and the difference of that last row here is that it has moved from ideology to partisanship. And people then ask the next question, what's the difference between ideology and partisanship? The difference is that when you are making partisan decisions, you are inconsistent. And you are not staying true to a particular ideology. And again, you might not like that ideology. If you're very liberal, you might not like Thomas and Alito and Roberts. If you're conservative, you might not like Kavanaugh and Kagan and Sotomayor or the policies that they push. But if they are being ideologically honest and ideologically consistent, we can live with it if they're trying to get to the right answer of the law. But once it becomes a Democrat issue and a Republican issue, now we've got an issue because the court is meant to be above politics. It is the reason, despite the fact that they may have made a mistake on this, that justices and all federal judges are meant to sit for life tenure, is to stay above politics. And those politics have bled into how the court decides. And that has fundamentally changed the game. How could the court stop the president? It could turn to tried and true precedents, past cases. We come from the common law system of England. And one of the reasons Article 3 of the Constitution, and take a look at it when you go home tonight, is so damn short. It's only 375 words, whereas the other two articles, Article 1 and Article 2, are quite a bit longer. And the reason it's so short, at least the theory goes, and the one that I spin, is most of the framers were lawyers. They'd all worked under the common law system. Congress was going to be different than the Parliament. A president was going to be different than what a king was. But they all knew the common law system. They thought it worked well. They wanted it to be our system. And so they were just going to keep it so they didn't have to say much. Okay? But what they did know and what they did think is that that common law system would keep law consistent and it would keep people in line, and that has fundamentally changed. And here are two recent, well, before I get to the quotes, I'll talk a little bit historically about how the court could stop the president. It could go back to its true colors, its original colors, and that's Marbury versus Madison. It's emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Marbury has been cited an incredible number of times, and I'll explain to you why it's an incredible amount of time, since 2016, since the first Trump presidency. The only jargon I will use tonight is the word modal. Comes from math. It's the mode. We've got the mean, which is an average. We've got the mode, which is the most, okay? Or the number of. The modal number of times that any of the court's 30,000 precedents that exist going back to 1791 are cited is 0. Most precedents are never cited again. So the modal category, if you're counting up the number of times precedents are cited, 0. They're just forgotten by history. Marbury alone has been cited 33 times since 2016 and has been cited more than 300 times since it was decided in 1803, and the court need look no further than that and say Marbury says that we are the ones who say what the law is. If you are violating the Constitution, we are going to tell you and you will listen. So that's how the court could begin pushing back, and the court historically has not messed around when it comes to the other branches trying to take the power of judicial review, as that quote from the president early in my presentation suggested. And I won't go into the entire story, but in 1997, the court in this case, City of Bernie versus Flores, slapped the wrist not of President Clinton, but of the Congress of the United States. Because Congress, in a law that many of you have heard of, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, not only was meaning to restore religious freedom that was being taken away by state and local and sometimes the federal government, but Congress went a step further. Because 7 years prior to City of Bernie, the court had actually overturned its key existing precedent in the area of religious freedom. And when Congress passed the RFRA, not only were they speaking to the court's decision, but they then, many members of Congress being lawyers, had a bit of additional hubris than members of Congress normally have, and they tried to write into law what precedent the court ought to use and must use in all religious freedom cases going forward. That didn't sit well with the justices. They took this case, which was a very boring case about a small Catholic church in the city of Bernie of Texas, wanting to add an addition to its church because its membership had gotten too big. And the court took the case to decide where the religious freedom was for the church, or whether or not the city could stop the church from adding on to this beautiful old Catholic parish. But in so doing, the court said to Congress, hey, you remember that case, Marbury versus Madison? We hold the power of judicial review. You don't tell us what precedents to follow. We tell you what precedents we're going to follow, and then you follow suit. And it's a case not about precedent. It's a case about religious freedom, but the court told Congress, for lack of a better term, to shut its mouth when it comes to what precedents the court should follow in the future. So what could the justices do today? They could tell the executive branch and Congress, if it decided to get involved again, that it's not going to hold the power of judicial review, that they hold the power, the 9 do, and that the executive needs to follow their lead, except that it hasn't done so. And it's continued to defer again and again, as those previous 2 data slides showed you. Why? Why is Congress, or why is the court not pushing back? 2 justices have recent views on precedent that have become very public very quickly. The first is Justice Thomas. And Justice Thomas said explicitly, these are his words, not mine, I don't think that I have the gospel, he's meaning precedent, that any of these cases that have been decided are the gospel, and I do give perspective to the precedent. But it should. The precedent should be respectful of our legal tradition and our country and our laws and be based on something, not just something somebody dreamt up and others went along with. In other words, Justice Clarence Thomas saying precedent really doesn't need to be followed by the court anymore if it's not grounded in our history and our traditions. And then in her book that just came out, Justice Coney Barrett wrote, given such disagreements, it's important to know that while the court gets the last word about who wins in an individual case, it does not necessarily get the last word about what the Constitution means. To see the point, imagine that the court decides a case called Smith versus Jones. The court's judgment is the formal document resolving who won the case, and the other branches of government can't interfere with it. But she goes on to say, and I cut it off, but they can interfere with how that case is applied going forward to other cases. So Why isn't the court going to stop the president? One argument is that there is at least two, and I tell you sincerely, a majority of justices who don't believe their own precedents need to be followed anymore. And you can see that in Roe versus Wade being overturned. And in a case that got short shrift, Roe was not yet 50 when it was overturned. But the court's Establishment Clause case, Lemon versus Kurtzman, was 50 years old and was overturned by the court in the same term with no explanation, and the court fundamentally changed the law on religious establishment, that is separation of church and state. So the reason, at least one, why the court isn't stepping up to the executive is that there is a majority of the court, or at least a plurality, and I think it is a majority, that doesn't think precedent does what we think it should do anymore in the legal system. And what does that all lead to? It leads to what I gave you from the start, and that is the punchline, and that is that we are in a constitutional crisis. Why? Because power has been consolidated into one branch of government. Congress is doing nothing. The judiciary is openly ceding power to the executive branch, and all of that power is sitting not in executive agencies, but in the Oval Office. And I was trying to figure out how to end the talk with the constitutional crisis, but this is exactly what has happened. On the left is that system of separated/shared powers. And on the other is exactly what is happening. Congress is slowly burning because it's doing nothing. And the bottom part of that panel on the right is justices in robes really ceding power to the executive branch. This is as much of a history lesson about where we have been in this country as to where we are now. And I tell you, this is not an ideological argument I'm standing up here making. It is not a partisan one I'm standing up here making. It is factually what is happening in Washington, D.C. right now, and nothing is being done to stop it. And we are moving very quickly towards a fully unitary executive system of government. You might call it other things. In political science terms, it is the power of one. And with that, I will stop, and I will take any and all questions that you all have. Thank you. So, yeah, I'll repeat the question. So why is his own party not standing up? And you would think historically that they would. Who stood up to President Nixon? His own party, led by one of the most conservative members of his party, Barry Goldwater of Arizona. And Barry Goldwater led the march to the Oval Office from Capitol Hill and said, you've got two choices. You resign immediately, or we have the votes in the House to impeach you, and FYI, I've got the votes in the Senate to convict you, and you're gone. Why practically did President Nixon resign? Because he got to keep all of the spoils of being a former president. If you're impeached and convicted, you lose all of that. You lose your pension, you lose your Secret Service detail, you lose everything. You would think that that model today might exist. The problem is that the Republican Party, and now I am putting it on one party, has fundamentally changed. And I don't think that there is a member of the president's party or of the Democratic Party right now who is strong enough to make that march to the White House with cameras on them and say enough is enough. And I can't give you an explanation for why, with the exception that the president has become so powerful, both within his own party and with everyone in the or with at least some semblance of a majority or plurality of people in the United States, that people have simply decided to defer to him. And you can see why with the three examples of the three folks who have been indicted. And, you know, if in fact he's going to continue to go after his enemies, people are going to not want to go back after him. And that's the best there is not a good reason why folks would not do it. But you're right. I mean, I think everyone, including in his party, can see. I've got one back here, and then I'll come back to you. I mean, that's a really good question. The question was, why would we need Congress if they're simply doing nothing? I mean, you would need a constitutional amendment to get rid of Congress, and that's not going to happen. And at some point, Congress will be relevant again, whether that's under the control of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or a third party for that matter, although that's very unlikely in this country. It's a matter of Congress being part of the Constitution and part of the government. It will not be gotten rid of. And maybe there's some argument to suggest that it should be if it's not going to do anything, or there should be some, this is a technical term, rejiggering of what powers Congress has. But again, that all comes down to passing constitutional amendments to make those changes. So, but I think it's a legitimate question.
I was commenting that the power of money and how it has influenced politics, and I'm talking about big money. When we're talking about all the billionaires that sat at Trump's inauguration, takeover of media, there's a real power there of money that has benignly accepted in large part what's going on with the unitary president.
Yeah, and what I will say to that is until there is a different majority on the United States Supreme Court, money will continue to be considered speech, and money will not be gotten out of politics. It simply won't be. And I will dare say, without offending anybody, that not in most people's lifetime in this room or my lifetime will there be a new majority on the United States Supreme Court. And until that new majority happens that says we could probably legitimately, because it's been done before, equate money with behavior rather than with speech, money is not going to be taken out of politics. And media and social media is something completely different as well, but it's all part of the same issue of money being in politics.
So I have a question. At the beginning, you mentioned that up until this year, you'd never really been concerned about how your views were being perceived by your students. Are you concerned at all about censorship from the university due to all the pressures coming from higher ed, higher ed?
Yes. So it so happens that I sit on a committee that is talking about and dealing with this issue now. It's the committee that oversees the university senate, and we are all concerned about that sort of censorship and what it means for academic freedom going forward. I think it's yes, we're incredibly concerned because I think it will mean the end of university and college education the way that we know it in the United States if universities are going to sign the presidential compact. On the other hand, the idea that, and this is maybe the one ideological thing I'll say tonight, the idea that I can get my students to believe anything I want them to believe, I have a hard enough time getting my students to hand assignments in on time. Right? And the notion that what I would say is a problem. Actually, I'll give you a better example than that. I live in enemy territory. I grew up south of Green Bay. So I bleed green and gold. And so on a Monday or a Tuesday, so I'm going to come into class tomorrow and I'm going to be whistling happiness because the Packers won and the Vikings lost. And I will give my students grief. And what I expect from them is when the opposite happens, when my team loses and the Vikings win, that they give me the same amount of grief. That sort of really trite debate about NFL football, right, really says all you need to know about where higher education should be, and that is we're not there to proselytize. The one thing that I'm there to proselytize about it, besides trying to get people to become Packers fans, is that you need to think for yourself. So my mantra, and I think any good professor's mantra, is we need to teach you three things, and that is to think critically, write well, and speak well. And if you want to go be a President Trump supporter or a J.B. Pritzker supporter or a Dalai Lama supporter, as long as you can make those arguments well orally and in writing and think critically about how you're making that argument, then good on you. That's what university education is. And I guarantee you this, that is what 95 to 99% of professors are thinking and how they teach. Even in the liberal arts, right, there's not an ideology of calculus. Now, if there's a mathematician in the room, you can argue with me about that. But right, we're learning integrals, and that's about it. But there is an ideology when it comes, or there could be, when it comes to political science or history or sociology or women's studies or LGBTQ studies, whatever it might be. That's where you're going to see the real pressure. I think we're all worried, right? And that's a roundabout way of me saying they are aiming at the wrong people, because we are not actually doing what some people think that we are doing, and that is proselytizing and or brainwashing adults who come to us. I think it's pretty easy to brainwash middle schoolers and even high schoolers who haven't fully formed their thoughts. My students, even if they're 18, they're adults and they've got their own beliefs that I am not going to be able to change. But the administration still thinks that we're going to. And I think that there are a lot of universities that are significantly worried about this. I can't say any more than that. I mean, this sounds like I'm rambling, but that's because this is such an in-your-face difficult issue for someone who believes that education is the be-all, end-all of what makes a good society. I will bet dollars to donuts that very few universities are going to end up signing that compact. And if that means that no university gets any federal funds anymore, then we're going to see a fundamental change to what higher education is and how it's funded and where it goes from here. There will be some private universities that will sign it, but the fact that MIT and Brown stood up and said no to begin with, and there are people at our university who are worried. Minnesota hasn't been named. Minnesota was named like on one of the 14 who the administration was going to initially go after for anti-Semitic behavior on campus, but they've not been asked to sign that compact. If they do, all bets are off on what happens, because university presidents and board of regents are incredibly scared, and I don't blame them, right? The University of Minnesota is a $5 billion entity. And if I'm in one of those positions, I'm going to be scared as well if we lose all that money. On the other hand, the president and the board of regents and the provost are there also to protect the university faculty. So it's going to be a very difficult decision for any land-grant university, let alone smaller colleges. And if you didn't get from this that I can't answer a question easily, especially when you hit me out of left field with that one, which is a great question, by the way, I just can't answer questions easily. So yeah, I think we're all worried is really what this comes down to. Whoever's got the microphone, I don't know who was next.
He just seems to have a special kind of power between fear and adoration. Do you think anyone else can hold on to that kind of power, or will things drift back more normally?
Listen, I think that you've hit the nail on the head. You cannot name anybody who has, and again, I don't think that our grandchildren are going to know in their history books what it was. But this gravitas that Donald J. Trump has is something that we have never seen in the political realm ever. And I don't even a JFK, right? There was something about Camelot, but it wasn't this. You cannot, I defy anyone in this room to name anyone who works for the president right now or is in the Republican Party who can do what he has done. I think we will start drifting back relatively quickly. If you are not fans of The Daily Show, that's perfectly fine. If you are not, you should go back to YouTube, and I think it was 3 Mondays ago, it might be 4 Mondays ago, where the president was, and I always forget her name, the dissident from the Philippines, who was under house arrest under the Duterte regime. And he had her on because she has a book out about what happened when he was in power and then what happened when he got out of power. And I think the thing, right, as I went through this talk, it wasn't as gloomy as I thought it was going to be. And what I can tell you is her argument, and she showed it empirically, that within 6 months of him being out of power in the Philippines, you saw institutions start to revitalize. You saw people start to revitalize. So if you are really concerned that all of our institutions are dead and they are DOA forever, that's not really going to happen, right? That there is a point, it might take longer than 6 months, but institutions have a way of rebuilding themselves, especially because I don't think there is nobody who can run in the Republican Party who they could still win, but would have the ability to do what he is doing and get people to listen to them.
I just have a question about presidents making money.
Yeah, it is a fundamental violation of the emollients clause, emollients clause of Article 2. You cannot make money as President of the United States, or off of being President of the United States, period, end of story. And again, this is a matter not only for maybe not for the courts, but at a minimum for Congress. And Congress has shown no willingness to stop this. And most recently, it was the president, I think he was in the Oval Office, hawking his son Eric's most recent book. And that is something that again, I think that we're not going to fight this because he will fight back with much more venom than we have to fight him on this. But this, if anything has happened in the administration that is a direct violation, word for word, literal meaning, it's that clause.
So I also hope that the cult of personality dies with the man, but I am deeply concerned about the role of the United States on the international stage and what has, the fundamental weakness of our system of government and how it can be co-opted by a charismatic leader. So curious to get your thoughts on our.
Yeah, I mean, look, I honestly thought that President Biden had done a pretty good job of bringing the U.S. government back into repute with the rest of the world. I honestly think he did. And for all of President Biden's faults, including it being very clear that he was in the throes of dementia, probably in ways that President Reagan even wasn't by 1988, and he was for sure as well, I think that the world will be more cautious this time around for the thought that it could just flip again in 4 years. It's going to take one or two or three, maybe four presidencies where it is a combination of presidents from both parties. Again, I don't believe there will be a third party. That's just not how our system works, and without constitutional amendment, for there to be stability across presidents of different parties on the foreign stage in order for the rest of the world to say, okay. The other way you can think about this is that we just become England, just on a much bigger scale. And that is, we continue to be a world player, but we are no longer a superpower because the world can no longer trust us. Yeah. I mean, and I think you just have to go back, and again, don't be upset with me if you think that this is opinion, but it is really difficult to watch a president say, we're going to give missiles to Ukraine. No, we're not going to give missiles to Ukraine. Well, we're going to give missiles to Ukraine. Ukraine should give up all of its territory. No, Ukraine shouldn't give up any territory. Russia should get whatever it wants. No, Russia shouldn't get anything. That's the problem. Right? I mean, you can think about all of the other gaffes and all of the other standing in front of the United Nations and saying, you all respect me more than anyone. I mean, we can laugh at that. And mostly because you look at the numbers and they're not true. But when you have foreign policy that is simply spinning your head, you've got a problem. So it's going to take, I'm not a presidential scholar and I'm not a foreign policy analyst, but those friends of mine who are suggest that it would take several cycles of presidents before we would get that respect back. It's a good question. I know there's a bunch of hands. I'm just going to keep going with the microphone, and then we'll move over to and I know there were some down here as well.
Yeah, thanks. I would like you to speak a little bit about what you feel is going on with gerrymandering. I mean, I know many of us feel the handcuff of the Electoral College, which would be, as we all know, incredibly difficult to get rid of. But what makes me so worried is that with the data capabilities that we have now, the data analysis capabilities, so that we can gerrymander just so in such a detailed way, how could we ever perhaps get Democrats back in the House, or any balance of power back and forth if people are able to gerrymander the House of Representatives?
Yeah, I'm the victim of gerrymandering. Our representative, who has been a very good representative, although he's been in and out of office a couple of times in the Minnesota House, one of the compromises that his party made was, I kid you not, cutting out our neighborhood from his district. And they made that, and it upset him because it was a neighborhood that was very supportive of him, but it was a compromise that his party was willing to make. The only way to do this in the end is to do what Minnesota actually does and have it be a nonpartisan commission. You need to go back to the exact rules of gerrymandering, where at its core, you keep towns together, you keep counties together, you keep neighborhoods together, and you do not let the party that controls the state legislature from drawing the lines. That's the only thing you can do. None of that takes constitutional amendment. That takes state legislatures standing up and saying, we're going to make this be a nonpartisan decision. And we were listening to NPR on the radio the other day, or yesterday actually, and it just happened to be a Republican who said this because it was a state legislator out of Missouri. And he said, look, we gerrymandered this way because the people of Missouri voted for this. Well, it turns out that whether at the state level or at the national level, not all the people of Missouri or Minnesota vote for every single representative, right? You vote for your own representative. And the notion that the people of Missouri actually voted to change the lines so that there will only be representation of one minority group in Missouri, and I think it's 7 seats, and all other 7 seats will be predominantly Republican/white seats, is simply nonsense. That's not what people vote for. They are voting for particular representatives in particular communities. But the Supreme Court has not made this easy. So the court has said racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Although I think in the Louisiana case, when it overturns Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which it's going to do at the end of June, at least that's what the oral arguments on Tuesday indicated, the court will probably say racial gerrymandering is okay from here on out. But before it does that, the court has made this distinction. Racial gerrymandering unconstitutional, but partisan gerrymandering, because parties are not protected classes, perfectly A-okay. Well, you go south of the Mason-Dixon, and race and party are correlated, I think above 0.9. I mean, the correlation gets close to 1, right? So you can't tell the difference. And so then what the court has said is, and I will get one jab in on the court, we will look at what the state legislature says is the reason. Was it partisan or was it racial? And the court's now going to believe what the legislature tells them. And I will tell you that at least 4 out of the 6 in the court's majority, if not 6 out of the 6, are not big fans of looking at the intent of legislators. In Justice Scalia's words, we are not psychologists or psychiatrists. We don't get in people's heads. You read the words that they wrote on paper when they write their law. But the court is turning to this idea, at least in this area, and I think some others, by saying, no, we'll just take the legislature's word for it. That and money are the 2 biggest issues that we have in politics that go well beyond any other problems that we have. And until the Supremes get on board with changing those 2 issues, nothing's going to change. That might be the most doom and gloom answer that I would give tonight. Yeah, so the question is, will there be a midterm? What would we do if he declared martial law and called off those elections? We have never not had elections. Civil War, War of 1812, World War I, World War II. Those are the declared wars, except for the Spanish-American War, and we had elections that as well. The problem the president has, let me start with what he's got in his pocket, and that is sending out troops to try to scare people away from polls. Certainly he can do that. I think that this is one place where the federal courts, and I think even the U.S. Supreme Court would say, and I think will say, that the president sending out troops where there actually is not conflict, where there is not insurrection, and he's not invoked the insurrection clause yet to declare martial law, he can't do so, especially without governors asking him to. But he's got that in his back pocket, and he could do it despite what the courts say. What cuts against the president is that elections are not run by the federal government. Now, you can try to scare people away from the polls. And I would suspect that the 7 million people who were on the streets on Saturday would have something to say about that, and they were there in a very peaceful manner. And I think that the idea that elections are problematic is not seen by the people who actually run elections, and I'll bet there's some of you who are election judges in this room. Everything is run not just at the local level, but at the precinct level. I think if people want to vote, they're going to vote. I do believe there will be midterms. And you know, you're going to come up to me after this and say, how in God's name can you say that with everything you've just told us and you've admitted that he can send out troops? I think there will be, and I can't tell you what they are, there will be real problems in this country if he tries to stop those elections. There won't be 7 million people on the street. Right? There might be 80 million. There might be 100 million people on the streets. People will vote. There will be an election. And the other thing that you need to know, and I don't say this lightly, but Donald J. Trump can't last forever. The other thing that he has is what we all have, and that is that he's mortal. And I don't mean that to be morbid, and I don't mean for, you know, I'm not calling for that. That's not what I mean. But again, to put with the question before about his gravitas, he can't be here forever. And there is nobody. And again, I won't ask you to name names, but think about them in your head who can do what he has done. I really wish that I could live to be 200, because I think that might be how long it's going to be before we figure out what it was. You know, is it some conspiracy theory that he had stuff on everybody? Is it just that he really did have that gravitas? Who knows? In the end, I think there will be elections, at least next November. Sure, go ahead. Look, I think that you have to stay in the know. I think you have to stay arguing for what you believe in. I think you have to keep doing everything you can to keep the country as close to the Republican, small r, ideal that it was founded on. And I think that the people on Saturday showed that there are many, many millions of people who believe that, and I think many, many millions more who didn't go to the marches for various reasons, because they had other things to do, whatever it might have been, who really do believe that this country is a great country. And I'll say, I'm not the most patriotic person in the world. I just never have been. But I love America in so many ways, and it's why I study political science. It's why I study American politics. It's why I study the courts. I think that there are more people who love the United States than there are people who want to see the United States torn down. And you'll note that I didn't say people who love versus people who hate, because that's not what the debate is. The debate is love of the United States because of the Republican form of government and Democratic form of government versus people who want to see a different form of government. Might still want the United States to be powerful, but in a very different way. And I think the only way that you get what you want in the United States is to stand up for it. And that's what you have to do. And that means not stopping calling, not stopping writing letters, not stopping marching. And again, that's for whatever you believe in, right? If your cause is not democracy, but your cause is, name it, right, taking down corporate America, or your cause is making sure that we protect all life as sacred, whatever that cause might be, the key American ideal is that we fight for what we believe in. And I think that might be the most difficult thing that I have seen with this administration from a political science standpoint and a legal scholar standpoint, and that is making the claim that freedom of speech is only free when you are saying what one side likes. And that ain't it, right? There was a Thomas Paine quote up here, right? And you want to go down fighting if you're going to go down. So that's the best thing I can say is you just keep fighting. You absolutely just keep fighting. And vote, and vote.
I'll pass. No, sorry, and this was about the elections. Oh. I can probably, being a former teacher, talk loud in a classroom. This is going back to about elections quickly, and I know probably many of us in this room act as election judges. I do, but what I'm finding is that, and because of the day, a lot of us are retired, we're elderly, and people that I originally volunteered with are not doing it anymore because the tone has completely changed, and they are afraid. So the point, our elections, the conductions of those elections, depends on numerous well-trained volunteers. And if I'm trying to encourage people to volunteer to be an election judge, but it is getting more and more difficult because of the tone of people coming in, and it's a long, tiring day.
It's a very long, tiring day.
Without having someone in your face and me having to say, I take an oath before we start this, I take it seriously, thank you for voting, move along. Now we cannot have that discussion.
Yeah, and that's, I think for me, it's very bothersome for me as well, because when it comes down to the precinct level, these are our friends and our neighbors, right? And that's, right, I mean, the idea that I would turn to the neighbors on the other side of my house and immediately be suspect of them is not the way that we treat people, right? It is problematic. I think the way that we change that is to start talking to people, not on computers, not via text. We have to talk to one another. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. A good number of my wife's and my friends don't share our political beliefs and our political ideology. And we can sit down and we can talk to them. That's changed, right? I mean, the good old days of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, right? Hammering out a budget in the Rose Garden. And Ronald Reagan hating everything about Tip O'Neill's politics, but loving Tip O'Neill as a guy, as a man, as a human being, as an American, whatever, however you want to put it. Now we're meant to hate one another if we're Republican and Democrat. That's how it changes. And so the other thing I think you can do is make sure that we're talking to people. And you've got to be able to talk to people. And all right, so let me have some empathy with you. You believe what I don't believe. Tell me why. Make me understand, and then I want you to understand me. It's not you like Donald Trump, you must be a horrible person. Oh, you hate Donald Trump, you must be an equally horrible person. That is what really has to stop. And then that comes back to election officials. And I think it comes back to trusting that our neighbors are going to do what's right. And I got to tell you, I have not yet been an election judge. Sorry. But what I do know is that it is really hard. It's also incredibly hard to cheat. It's also incredibly hard to make mistakes. 99.999% of the votes cast in the United States are legitimately cast, right? And when a news story comes on that says, oh my God, we caught someone cheating. Well, the story isn't that someone tried to cheat. The story is actually that they were caught, that the system worked. So last thing I'll say, because I got off track on it being hard to get election judges, I know a lot of high school teachers who give extra credit to their students in social studies classes for being election judges. They not only get a day off of school, but they get free lunch, right? They get some benefit out of it. And now you've hooked an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old, and they say, well, I put in all this training, maybe I should do this for the rest of my life. So the real fix is to get the young people involved. And then the fix for society more generally is that we gotta talk to each other. And I just bang my head against the wall that we don't. And the last thing I'll say about that is one of my favorite students of all time was a student who, she now works, she's a lifer at the DEA, she's a lawyer. And she was very conservative. And you're at a major university where the truth is most students are more liberal. They self-select. And this young woman, who's not young anymore because this was 2004, would speak her mind in my class day in and day out. She'd push back on people's theories and people's arguments. And she's one of my favorite students of all time. And I may not have agreed with half of what she said, but she always made great arguments. She always backed those arguments up with evidence. And she had a platform and she could use it. And there are so many people who don't think they have that platform anymore, whether it's in university or otherwise. So young people, and we damn well better start talking to one another or things aren't going to change. Yes, sir.
I would add one more thing, and that is we'd better be ready to work on people's campaigns who are decent people and get them elected to office.
Yeah, and I think the answer is,
And that we can do with our time and money.
yes, the key part to what you said is decent people, right? And that means if you can find someone, even if they are not of your party persuasion, but you think they're going to do well for you and for the country or for the state or whatever it might be, your city, if it's city council, that those are the people we want in office. We do not have to agree on everything. But you've all heard the cliche, we sure as hell agree on a whole lot more than we disagree on, right? We disagree on some very fundamental, very difficult issues, but we should be able to weather those disagreements. And so you're right, I think working on campaigns is key. Here and then here. There is no chance that that happens. I mean, I think he can try to force the issue with martial law, right? I mean, that's a possibility, but under the current, there is no way. He can't run as vice president. And I'll tell you this, if there is a caveat, which there's not, that he could run for a third term, you know who's running against him? Barack Obama. Or possibly, well, not even Michelle. They would run Barack Obama for his third term. And I'm telling you right now, that's a race you'd like to see. Yes, ma'am.
This is a big subject, but regarding misinformation and lies that are left and right all over the place, has anybody ever tried to start, I don't know, a bipartisan commission on truth, or is anybody working on that on the side? I heard the Democrats were trying to have a truth commission, but without Republican support. What can you say about that?
Yeah, without it being a bipartisan effort, right? Unless you get something like what happened in South Africa, where you had a truth commission that was also a reconciliation rather than a punishment commission, it's going to be very difficult to do. And if you don't get buy-in from both parties, then people will think that it is, I hate to use the loaded word, but a rigged group. And I think that the group who is best at it would be journalists, but mainstream media has now come to be seen as partisan itself, or distrusted by at least some large segment of the population. But I think there's got to be something. As for the idea of the first part of your question about Mr. Trump's lawyers, I will tell you this, that if the Democrats win the House, well, if they win the House, he's going to be impeached on like 86 different charges. If they happen to win the Senate, they will try him. They will not get the votes to convict him. There will not be Republicans who will jump ship for that. But they will make his last 2 years in office as unpleasant as they feel like he's made theirs. And there will absolutely be, once he is out of office, despite Trump versus the United States, there will be people who will end up going to jail. Would it be President Trump who would go to jail? Probably not, given Trump versus the United States. But I think everybody all the way up to the Vice President of the United States are at risk of going to jail at some point.
Yeah, Nixon's people were.
Right? Yeah, yes. And then back here. Here first, and then back here. What news sources do I like to listen to? Look, I think that, and I take this from my 23-year-old, and let me put him in context. He has a degree in journalism from what he will tell you is the #1 journalism school in the world, and he's not necessarily wrong, the University of Missouri, and on many rankings it beats Columbia and Northwestern. And he is Gen Z. I think Gen Z. at 23, the most nonpartisan, Reuters and the AP. That's it. And he doesn't want to read much more, and I've come more and more in agreement with him. I think NPR is still, despite the bad rap from some sides, still stays relatively nonpartisan. And then, you know, honest to God, don't look at me sideways. I think you can watch both CNN and Fox. Here's the caveat. You can watch both if you're only watching the news. My problem with either of those stations is that now almost 24 and a half hours is taken up with talking heads. But who walked out with all of the other media outlets from the DOD? Fox News did. If you just look at the news that they put out, they might cover different things, but they're putting out the same news that the Times and the Post and CNN and NBC, ABC, CBS, and the NewsHour are putting out. But I don't like Fox, MSNBC, CNN, any of them, because I don't need people to tell me what to believe when I hear a speech from the president or the speaker or whomever, or a governor, whatever it might be. I just want the damn facts, and then I want to make those decisions on my own. But in terms of straight nonpartisan, Reuters, AP, end of story, will give you the most just straight up factual accounts of what's going on. So, but I think you should be reading both sides. I think you should read the Times and you should read the Wall Street Journal. I think you should read the Washington Post and you should read the Washington Times, right? And mainstream media, whether they lean right or lean left, you don't need to read the editorial pages to get the news that they're putting out. So read the straight up facts. Read from both sides, but you don't need to read from the extremes of both sides, but make sure that you're getting a full picture of what everyone is saying. So I think there is a incredible chance that the military is the last stand to stop him with this problem. The problem is that all the top brass are resigning. So, I'm not a military expert, and I'll bet a couple people in this room might be. The problem is you can't just take, I mean, you can, but it's not really going to work. You can't just take a captain or a lieutenant and make them a general or a brigadier general or an admiral. That's just not how that system works. And the military is going to be a complete mess if that happens. If all of these people who are running the military now are not fully pushed out, and of course the Joint Chiefs were, that's not where the game is at. The game is at where the generals and the top brass are the ones who will really carry out orders. If enough of those folks can stay in their offices and say no, that's going to put a stop to a lot of this. But again, that depends on who stays in office. You all ask amazing questions. This is one of my favorite things to do. I think my students are pretty smart. You all are incredibly smart, and I appreciate your questions and appreciate the interaction. Thank you all.